with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Ryan Mitchell, who will be presenting on hydrology.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks everyone for showing up and coming out. This is the technical portion of this presentation. So I'll be discussing, I know my voice is hard to hear, so I'll try to speak up. I'll be discussing the local groundwater hydrology, things that we know, the data we have, the data we don't have, and I'm a groundwater hydrologist, so the technical science guy. So today we will go through a regional overview from a science perspective, a hydrogeologic perspective. We will also discuss basin and range aquifer systems briefly. That's the type of aquifer the Douglas Basin is comprised of. We'll discuss the existing data that DWR has, the data we collect, the limitations we have, the data gaps that we have. Those will include water level trends, so depth to water measurements, water level elevation measurements. It will also include land subsidence data that we've recorded. And then we'll also discuss some future data needs where we'll be reaching out to you, the public, the locals, to help us to collect more data as we develop and prepare a groundwater flow model for the basin. Give us 1 second. All right. So this is an oblique view, an aerial shot. It shouldn't be new to anyone in this room, but this is the Douglas AMA boundary. So what controls the boundary on the mountain fronts are the peaks. So the surface highest point of elevation, that is what's called the surface groundwater divide. Water will flow towards the Douglas Basin inside of the blue polygon that you see on the screen. It goes down to Mexico and abuts with Agua Prieta. It also goes up past Alfreda towards Wilcox. So this is the boundary. It's slightly larger than the IMA boundary. And it is what we will be eventually developing a groundwater flow model for. Generally, the area is a high desert, so at elevation, mountain bounded. So this is an extensional block faulted alluvial basin. There are mountain ranges that go up to 7,000 feet above land surface. There's one perennial stream, which is Leslie Creek within this footprint. The climate is arid to semi-arid. The precipitation in the basin, we've seen historically 10 to 14 inches of rain at the basin floor, and you get about 24 inches of rain on the mountain fronts. Elevation does get additional precipitation. And the mountain fronts are gonna be where aquifer recharge occurs. So it's good to know what our inflows are, how much water is coming in naturally. This is a view of the state of Arizona. This is, it breaks it up into the 3 physiographic provinces of the state. So up here is the Colorado Plateau. So if you've been to the Grand Canyon, that's the big flat layer cake geology. The topography is pretty flat. There's not a lot of faulting or geologic structures. You come down further south into the transition zone. This is the zone where you have a lot of metamorphic rocks and folding and faulting, a lot of jumbled up rocks there. But down here, this whole section is called the Basin and Range Physiographic Province. And what that basically means is that all of these orientations that you see that are going to the northwest, they're all the ridgelines and basins from extensional block faulting. So I have a graphic that helps illustrate that in a moment, but just know that we are down here in one of these alluvial extensional basins. So in alluvial extensional basins, they do create very deep, the structure creates a very deep basin that backfills with a eroded alluvium from the mountains. So these units are typically fantastic aquifer units because they're large, they're deep, and they'll have unconsolidated material like sands and gravels that will hold water or host the water, and those are called aquifer units. Bedrock is not the greatest aquifer unit. It can't hold a lot of water within it. You typically are forced to go through fracture flow. So alluvial basin fill aquifers are typically the primary aquifer source used in the Basin and Range province. So, as I said, alluvial aquifers are typically unconsolidated, so sometimes compaction can make them slightly consolidated. That is insignificant because if you become cemented or compacted, groundwater can't flow. So, unconsolidated alluvium is what typically you find for aquifer systems. There's a mixture from fine silts and clays all the way to coarse gravels and cobbles. It all depends on where you are in the basin, how close to the mountain front you are, and how deep you are. So this last bullet here says there's high spatial variability, and that's true. You could be in the same basin, step over a couple hundred feet, and hit different lithologic units below your feet. You might not hit any sands or gravels. You might be in clay the whole way. So there's a lot of spatial variability within these basins. So this is a quick graphic that helps to illustrate all those northwest trending valleys and mountain peaks. So when you take cratonic hard bedrock and you stretch it, so we start pulling it from both sides, this is what the extensional block faulting is. But when you pull it, what ends up happening is that these big chunks where the fault lines break will end up leaning over, and it kind of looks like a bunch of books that you knock over on their side. So what used to take up this much space laterally, so let's say it's 100 miles, when you lay it out like that, you're now at 150 miles from end to end. But what you create are these deep basins here, these ridges. So when looking at that previous map of Arizona, we saw high points, we saw the basins. This is the geologic mechanism that created those basins. So
Can I ask you a question? I know the questions are later, but some of the terminology, with all due respect, that you're using is very comfortable for you because you're in the field. Is there some way to make it a little bit more user-friendly for all of us out here that
Sure.
that are not in that field?
yes, of course. And good note too. I tend to pontificate, so thank you.
Thank you.
So this is what happens when the earth gets stretched. So the crust is stretched. This is a very old, hundreds of millions of years ago. This was what formed the landscape of Arizona. This type of geologic regime. It's just letting us zero in on one of these basins, one of these valleys, and the valley here is where the alluvial aquifers are. And most of them have very similar characteristics. They look the same. They were deposited at the same time. They have a lot of the same structure to them. So we're going to zoom in on just schematics. This is just an example of one of these basins. But the Douglas Basin is one of these types of basins. So if you zoom into imagine we're just in Douglas right now. You've got the mountains to the west, mountains to the east, and you've got this, bedrock contours below you. So this is what the depth of bedrock would look like. When these basins, when the earth crust stretches and this valley opens up and they're created, erosion will come in from the high points. So like the tallest peaks are the ones that wind and rain and weather will knock down first. And what you'll get is you'll typically get a deposit towards the bottom of these basins that's mostly coarse-grained sediments. So that's the stuff that's really good for water production. It has high hydraulic conductivity, meaning water can go through it really quick. If you were pumping a well that's in a gravel unit, you'll see very little drawdown in the well. You'll get a lot of water. So these are usually the type of alluvial sediments that you want. And they'll fall down first because when these basins are opened and when this structure event is happening, there's no flow through drainage yet. So we look at the surface now and we see rivers passing through, basins are interconnected, but initially they weren't. And so a lot of the sediments stay trapped in the bottom and they fill it up like a bathtub full of sand. And it starts off with the heavy coarse-grained stuff in the bottom, the bigger pieces. And as time moves on, these mountains that were eroded are now being eroded slower because you've already removed a lot of the material, and so you start to get finer grained stuff. So this finer grained stuff, you'll see this sequence in almost all of the alluvial basins, but it's coarse grained stuff, fine grained stuff, and usually the fine grained stuff will be like clays and silts that don't make good water, but they'll usually be on top of the coarse grained material. And then later on, when there's ability to spill over or for surface water to leave the basin, is when you start to get like river deposits. So most of the basins that you'll see in Arizona will have a very similar stratigraphy is the term, but The very similar structure here. Coarse stuff on bottom, fine stuff in the middle, and the mixture on the top, because you have rivers that are depositing stuff. So if this was all saturated and filled with water, the groundwater table would look kind of like this. It would come up slightly towards the edges of the basin. The water table is what it's called. And if this is a river where you have surface streams, you'll usually have a little bit of a higher amount of water, groundwater in that area too. Depth of water is typically shallower when you're close to an active river. So this is a map with squiggly lines, so I'll try to explain it. This is a view of the depth to bedrock. These are contour lines. So contour lines represent a single value across the whole line. It's like a bathtub ring. If you look in your bathtub ring, that bathtub ring is going to be, 12 inches from the bottom all the way around. Each one of these lines represent a single elevation all the way around. If that makes sense. So the first one here is 400 feet. So that's below land surface before you hit bedrock. As you're close to the mountains, that 400 foot is really close to the mountain range. Makes sense. The basin is thickening as you go towards the center. The next contour line is 800 feet. This one right here is 1,600 feet, so we're getting pretty deep in the middle. And then this section here is over 3,200 feet in the Douglas Basin. So when looking at this diagram, that deeper section is going to be this part. And as you go to the east, it'll be slightly shallower, but still pretty deep. So some of the existing data that DWR that we have a series of index wells, we call them. So we have a staff of field geologists and hydrologists that go out and measure thousands of wells across the entire state. They do it, some of the wells are measured quarterly, some are annually, some are done every 5 years. But we have a very large staff of folks that go out and they constantly grab water level measurements. In the Douglas Basin, we have 40 of our index wells. And what makes it an index well is that the landowner allows us on their property to take a water level. Like to have more than 40, so if you guys are willing, please reach out after this presentation. But we do have staff that would, come out and measure your depth of water for you. We also do what's called basin sweeps. These ones are not on such a regular schedule. These are when all the field guys get together and say, we're going to go to this one basin, maybe there's 20 of them, and we're going to get every well we can in a very short period of time, just like a few months. And when we do, they call them basin sweeps. So in the Douglas Basin, these are the sweeps that have been done, and they go back to 1990. As you can see, in 1990, we collected 712 water level measurements, and then in 98, 516, then in 2005, 385, then 330, then 209. There's a decrease in the amount of wells that we are given permission to access. A lot of it has to do with land ownership changing and new owners not wanting people on their property to collect water levels. A lot of this one for 2001 had to do with COVID. People didn't want strangers near them around their property. But in general, it is a downward trend of number of water level measurements. So the more data, the better. The more data that we can collect, the more accurate our models can be. And so you can't accurately represent something in a groundwater flow model if you don't have enough data. So no such thing as too much. We also have measured discharge data. So there are multiple ways of measuring well discharge. The most common way is with some kind of impeller flow meter. But we will go out and verify discharge rates for folks where we say, yes, this is an approved water metering device, whether it's an impeller flow meter, magnetic flow meter, and then we'll also get a secondary way of measuring it too. So like a bucket test, or using either a Baker tank or something larger. But we'll have two methods of verifying what the discharge rate is, and then we'll be able to say the well yield. So when you say, okay, this well we know pumped at this rate. May not be the maximum rate, could be limited by the pump capacity, but we will verify those measurements, and they were used for previous INA discharge rates. We've collected some of those in the Douglas Basin. This is some of the existing data that we do have. We have 118 different wells that we've collected discharge rates from within the Douglas Basin. And then there's something called specific capacity, which is when you have access to the pumping water level as well. So sometimes when the pump's running, you can't get your sounder down to grab a water level, but sometimes people will put an access tube or a sounding tube into their well, and while the pump's running, you can get the pumping water level. When you know what the pumping water level is and the discharge rate, you can calculate specific capacity, which is represented as gallons per minute per foot of drawdown. So an easy way to think of it is, let's say you're pumping at 100 gallons a minute and you have 10 feet of drawdown in the well. That would be a specific capacity of 10. So you get 10 GPM, 10 gallons per minute for each foot of drawdown that you are recording in the well. But a lot of wells don't have access to pumping water levels. So that's why there's 118 discharge measurements, but only 28 specific capacity measurements. There's also 2 USGS stream flow gauges in the Douglas Basin. In the presentation, just so you guys have access, I've put the links to them in here, but there's the Whitewater Draw and Leslie Creek. So anyone can click on these links and go see what the perennial flow streams look like, what the surface water flow looks like at these places. So this is a quick list of what data is currently available to us. One other thing that we do is we do have a group of geophysicists, and the geophysicists will go around with gravity meters, and they'll record microgravity data. They'll also record land surface elevation, and they will do it at survey grade or sub-millimeter measurement grade, and they'll use that to record land subsidence. I know subsidence is pretty, in my opinion, a pretty significant concern. It can damage property, it can damage roads, it can hurt people if you're not prepared for it. But I'll quickly go through some of the land subsidence features and how they're developed. The other source of data that we have are self-reported INA pumping information. So when folks that have INA properties and they self-report how much water they've used, we have access to that data too. So this is the collection of our existing available data. So this map here, we're going to look at 3 different hydrographs. It's just the way it sounds, hydrograph. It's just a graph of the water level. Here is just so you know where these wells are located. All these blue dots are the 41 index wells that our folks have access to. This one lone red dot in the middle actually has an automated data transducer, so it actually records data automatically and then sends it. Turn my mic this way. But then I can't see. So we call these GWSI, so groundwater site inventory wells. Anybody can go to our interactive web map on our website, and you can look at this map and you can see which wells are near your home or near your property. You can click on any of the wells that we have here on these with the blue dots, and you'll be able to see whatever data we've collected for that well. So some of these data go back to the 60s. Some of them are only recent data. But here's one towards the north of the Douglas AMA boundary. And this initial reading was 90 feet below land surface in 1965. And then in 2002, the depth to water was almost 300 feet. So within that period, that's a pretty significant drop, and that's the regional water table over time slowly declining. Here's the well in the center. You can see some somewhat confusing looking red dots. These are water level measurements where there was a remark or a comment by the field geologist who went out there. So it could be things like the well was on, the well was running. It's usually the one you see. But we do have historical data going back to 1946 for this well. Initial depth to water was 40 feet below land surface, and then 2002 was 91 feet below land surface. And then here's a well that's closer to the city of Douglas. First measurement here was in 1970, so not as old data. Depth of water of 195 feet, and then 2022, we're at 355 feet. So as you can see from the top of the basin all the way down, there's been just overall decline, a water level decline over the decades. So this is another contour map, but we're not looking at bedrock. This is actually the water level, the water table. So groundwater doesn't behave like a lake or an ocean. The surface isn't perfectly flat. Some areas will be higher or lower than others, depending on pumping and recharge and things like that. And what these contours represent are the water table surface. So, if you look at this contour here, the elevation, this is taking away depth from the surface elevation completely. So imagine there's no surface at all. This is just what does the water look like if you take away all the soil. Over here, the elevation of that would be 4,200 feet, all along that entire contour line, right? Because these represent a single measurement, that entire line is the same there, right? But if you look here, you have what's called a closed contour. And when you have a contour that makes a donut circle like that, it's usually a depression cone of some kind. So we see one from, this is from 2005, we see a depression cone here. We also see some concentric compression cones down here. But let's jump ahead 10 years. Here we actually have developed another water level contour line of an additional 50 feet of drawdown. So we are seeing additional drawdown in just 10 years, enough to develop a regional decline of an additional 50 feet in these areas. Another way to look at water level data that might be more intuitive is how much has my individual well declined over the years. And this map is representing all the wells that we have had access to water level data over the last 31 years. We wanted to look at recent data, so the last 3 decades. And essentially, the bigger the circle, the more decline it has, the well has shown. So this will be posted as well. I know it's probably hard to see in an auditorium, but there's some dots that are really small, and there's some dots that are much larger. The larger the dot is the higher amount of observed drawdown over the 31 years. And so you can see where they're concentrated. We've got a bunch here, and we've got some down here that are more than 100 feet of decline in the last 31 years. The maximum decline that we've seen in these wells is over 200 feet, and this is still in that same 31-year period. But the average decline, if you look at all of them, none of them showed a rise. None of them have come up over the last 30 years. But the average decline is 44 feet for all of these wells.
Sir, I figure you're wrong at 44 feet, because you guys measured 2 of my wells, they've only dropped 6 inches in 50 years. I believe you need to go back and check your records.
Okay, we'll do that.
I have a question for you.
So we'd really appreciate if you guys would hold your questions until the end. We do have a lot of material to get to, and hopefully throughout the course of the presentation we'll answer a lot of those questions, but we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer questions, and we'll be able to go back to different slides earlier in the presentation if we need to at that time.
Question of hydrology. My well went up. It went up 2 feet.
These are all wells that we have in our index books, which means they've been surveyed and they're recorded using the USGS methods. So we need to only use data that we can say, hey, we measured this ourselves, we used our own equipment, we did our own stuff, this is internally verified. So that's why we don't have every single well, there's thousands in the basin.
But this was done by the department last year and this year. And he could not believe the person that went out there that the well went up 2 feet. And it's on record in your department.
If it was someone from our department that went out there, it would be one of my staff, so I would know and be aware. And these data here are from all of those sweeps and those collections of data. So if your well was measured and it's an index well, that meaning that one of our guys went there and recorded the data, you should be able to go to it on the map, click on it, and see your hydrograph. And if you've shown, if we've measured a rise, we would see it on the hydrograph.
I got my card from there.
From the well yield data, so now we're moving back to the pumping rates. So these are the verified rates that we recorded ourselves using 2 different types of flow measurements. The rates that we were able to observe have ranged between 30 and 1600 GPM. I know wells out here can do more than that. These are just the ones that we had our staff out to measure. But the problem is that we haven't done any of our own measurements out there since 1997. People don't want us to measure their discharge rates. So these data could be old, at least for the pumping rates.
Is this data
The water levels could be domestic, but for the most part, they're all larger wells.
What you're showing is irrigation wells.
These wells here will all be ones that range from 30 to 1600 GPM. So 30 GPM would imply that it's a domestic well or a smaller well.
Right.
So that's probably a mix, but this, like the previous slide, any of these dots, you can click on them on our interactive maps and see all the information we have about them. You can see any discharge data we've collected, you can see any water level data we've collected. Anything that we do is all public information. And then we also have the self-reported annual water use. So land subsidence, this is a helpful illustration to show you what it is and how it happens. This is a block diagram, so just imagine this is sand and gravel filled with water, and this is the land surface. And this blue dashed line is the water table, or the top to water, depth of water. Land subsidence, by definition, it's when the surface elevation is lowered due to overpumping of aquifer units, and you say, well, how does pumping groundwater make the land surface go down? So I'm going to show you guys how that works, but let's take a block. So imagine this is a perfect square or cubic foot. So let's take a block of the aquifer. It's full of sand and gravel and silts and clays and whatever else, but it's also fully saturated. It's got full of groundwater, right? So all of the interstitial pore space, or the room in between the sand grains, is filled with water. That water does have something called hydrostatic pressure, meaning it exerts a pressure back out to the sand and gravel. It's the same thing as when you go deep in your swimming pool and your ears need to pop. It's because the deeper you go, the water is actually exerting a pressure on you. The same thing happens with aquifer units. So the sand and gravel has its own side and weight and everything, but the water itself is heavy. And the water will sit inside of these pore spaces and kind of help hold some of the sand open. It makes the aquifer formation permeable, so water can pass through it. But if you drop the water table down and you dry out that cube, for example, there's no more water holding up the pore space in the interstitial pore space. And so what you get is that the sand and gravel that used to be somewhat porous has now compressed and is less porous now. There's not enough room for water to go back in. Another reason why this is a problem is because once you do that, water's not, let's say we recharge and the water level comes back up, you won't be able to rebuoy that formation back up. So the elevation won't go back up again. So the term is, it's inelastic, meaning it doesn't go back. Once it's depleted and goes down, you've lost aquifer storage, because now you can't fit as much water into that cube anymore, because it's not a cube, it's a flattened box now. So the reason why we want to monitor it is because, yes, it is a permanent loss of aquifer storage. Of whatever that volume was that made this cube tall again, the amount that it compressed by is now no longer able to be rebound by. So here's a map and a link to. This is from one of our reports that you can find on our website. This is a land subsidence map in the Elfrida area. And if you look, over the course of 12 years, over 15 inches of surface subsidence has occurred in the Elfrida area. So anyone can click this link, read the report, see the data, look at the